Hi, welcome to the module on the aorist and future passive indicatives. So far, we've covered the first aorist and the second aorist, active and middle forms, but we haven't covered the passive forms yet. And we've also covered in previous modules the future active and middle forms, but again, we have not covered the passive forms. So everything that we're going to be covering for this next module is below this line. We're having understood the aorist active and the aorist middle, and even going over some unusual forms like the liquid aorist active and liquid aorist middle. We're now going to learn the passive forms for the aorist tense and the passive forms for the future tense. So let's begin. The way we form the first aorist passive indicative form is we take the augment, we take the verbal root, and we introduce a new tense formative. This theta eta, this theta eta is what we call a passive voice tense formative. So it indicates the use of the passive voice. And then to this passive voice tense formative, we add the secondary active suffixes, the new, sigma, nothing, men, te, and instead of new, which is what we would expect for the imperfect forms, we're adding a different form called san. And the reason why we have san for the third person plural is that it allows us to differentiate it from the first person singular. And so now we have a separate set of suffix endings for each of the first, second, and third person singular, as well as the first, second, and third person plural forms. So let's see what the form of the first aorist passive indicative looks like. So if I want to say I was loosed, I would take the augment, I would take the verbal root, and again we're using our paradigmatic luo, and then we'll take the tense formative the, and then we're going to add the new. So if you remember your tense formatives, this indicates as passive voice, and this will indicate that this is the suffix ending we're using for the aorist tense. So eluthane is I was loosed. Eleuthes is you were loosed, and that's formed by taking the augment, the verbal root, the tense formative, and again we're anticipating that the secondary suffixes used for the aorist tense would be new, sigma, nothing, men, te, and instead of new it's san. So eleuthes is you were loosed, and take the augment, the verbal root, the tense formative the, and add nothing to it, and then it's eleuthe, and that's he, she, it was loosed. And it does not have a movable new, because the movable new is only used if the vowel at the end of the verb is a short vowel, and this is a long vowel, theta, so it doesn't use the movable new. To say we were loosed is you take the augment, the verbal root, tense formative, and then you add men. So eleuthemen. To say you all were loosed, it's eleuthete. And to say they were loosed is eleuthesan. So let's say the paradigm all together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Eleuthane, eleuthes, eleuthe, eleuthemen, eleuthete, eleuthesan. We also have a second aorist passive form. These are rarely used. You don't see them often, but it looks almost exactly the same as the first aorist, using the paradigmatic luo. But for a second aorist form, we're going to use grapho. And the way we form it is, instead of the tense formative, theta, eta, we don't see this tense formative being used. The theta actually drops, and the reason why it drops is usually because of pronunciation. If I were to write out using the normal form, a graph thane, you have to catch your breath there, and a graph thane, and you have to pause a little bit. And so a lot of times the Greeks don't want to catch their breath in the middle of a word, and so just for pronunciation's sake, a graphane is a lot easier to say than a graph thane. And so not all, but a few number of aorist passive forms use what we call the second aorist form, which looks exactly like the first aorist, luo, except instead of the tense formative they, it doesn't use they, it uses just the eta, the theta drops. And so if I want to say I was written, and Paul actually uses the expression, you all were written on my hearts when he talks to the Corinthians. So we can think of it as this way. If I was written on the heart of Paul, the form would be the augment plus graph, which is your verbal root, and then instead of thane, we would use ain. So graph fane. If you were written on my heart, it would be a graph face. So again, not face, but face. The theta drops. Otherwise, it looks exactly the same as the Lua paradigm. And if I were to say, he, she, it was written in my heart, it would be a graphe. We were written in the heart of Paul, it would be a graphe men. You all were written, a graphe te, and then they were written, a graphe san. And these are the second aorist passive indicative forms. Now let's introduce the future passive form. And just by way of review, since it's a while since we revisited the future tense, remember that if I were going to take luo as my paradigmatic verb, to form the active future form, let's say the first person singular, it would be luso. I add that sigma there, and that tells me it's I will loose. If I want to make it middle, so I want to put the emphasis on the subject of the sentence, so I myself will loose, it would be loosemai. But how do I say I will be loose? It's a different form. So how do I now introduce the passive form for the future tense? And the way I would do this is, notice that there's no augment. The augment is not there. And the reason why is it's a future tense, it's not past time, so it uses no augment. Instead, I begin with the verbal root. I have the passive tense formative, they, but I also combine that with the sigma, because the sigma tells me it's future, the they, or the theta eta, tells me that it's passive voice. Then I add the connecting vowel, and then I add the primary middle passive suffixes that you already know. That's my, si, tai, meta, site, nentai. And that'll get me the form for the future passive indicative. What would be I will be loosed? Here is my verbal root, lu. Here is my passive voice tense formative, they. Add the sigma to make it future, the connecting vowel omicron, and my. And the suffix. And so luthesamai is I will be loosed. How do I say you will be loosed? Take the verbal root, take my passive voice tense formative, add the sigma to make it future. And remember that whenever you add the connecting vowel epsilon with psi, this suffix, the sigma becomes sandwiched between two vowels and doesn't like it, so it drops. And we already know that from our big 5 little 2 rules, that epsilon plus alpha becomes an eta, and that iota here subscripts, and hence this is the final form that we see. So they say iota subscript is you will be loosed, and then take the verbal root, the tense formatives, and then the connecting vowel and the suffix luthesatai, and that will be he, she, it will be loosed. We will be loosed is luthesamatha, You all be loosed will be lutheseste, and they will be loosed. It will be luthesantai. So let's say this together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Luthesamai, luthese, luthesatai, luthesamatha, lutheseste, luthesantai. The second future passive forms, using grapho again, it forms the same way as what we did with luo, and except for one thing. That theta again, remember that theta that we would expect to see to be all the way down this column on the tense formative? This theta has dropped. And so instead of using thase as our tense formative, we're using ace. This is our tense formative. Otherwise, it looks exactly like luo. So it uses a different tense formative where the theta drops, but otherwise it'll look exactly like luo. So if I want to say I will be written on people's hearts, graphesamai, where I have the verbal root, I have the tense formative, I have that connecting vowel, and I have the primary past and middle suffixes. And so graphesamai is I will be written, verbal root, graph, tense formative, ace, and then we know that this form will result when we add psi to the connecting vowel epsilon. Graphese is you will be written. Graphesetai is he, she, it will be written. Graphesamatha is we will be written. Graphesamatha is we will be written. Grapheseste is you all will be written. And graphesantai is they will be written. Let's say this together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Graphesamai, graphese, graphesatai, graphesamatha, grapheseste, graphesantai.